The Creative Assembly has had a weird history. These days they're mostly known for their Total War games and Alien Isolation, but in the mid-2000s someone on the team decided that trying their hand at hack and slashes was a good idea. It started with Spartan Total Warrior in 2005 and ended with Viking Battle4Asgard in 2008, but Viking was the only one I actually played back on the 360s, so I'm starting here rather than with Spartan. At the time, I didn't own many games and didn't really care about the quality, so when my brother borrowed a slightly glitchy copy of it from a friend, I ended up playing it mostly just because it was there. I didn't get very far, but I remember it being sort of enjoyable, and when I saw it years later on a Steam sale, I bought it out of curiosity and never touched it till now. Now, I should probably preface this with something before I get yelled at. The PC port of Viking is awful. It's capped at 30 FPS and chugs like fuck, and to top it all off, the game basically tells you aren't playing it on the right platform right from the beginning. I dusted off my old 360 gamepad so the controls should be fine, but as for the frame rate, there's not much I can do. I looked around for some solutions and stumbled along a guide that said it was fixable if you installed a cheat engine, but honestly I'd rather trust something I bought off the Silk Road than use the site they linked. Add to that another comment mentioned that doing this might work, but would ultimately fuck the rest of the game since aspects of the game's speed is tied to the frame rate. I don't know how true that is, but it's the first time I've heard of a game doing that post 1999, and besides I've played games at 30 FPS for years, so it's not too hard to acclimate to. If you're the kind of person whose rig puts the monolith to shame and can't stand to see anything below 120, then I'm sorry. Plus, my computer might as well have been made from parts from Garner's PC graveyard, so it chugs like fuck anyway. After an intro monologue given by Brian Blessed, we're introduced to our protagonist Skarin, who looks like he's about to eat shit hard until Freya comes in and saves him, appointing him as her new champion in the mortal realm. I've got to be honest, I've played this game a few times over the past few years, and I honestly couldn't tell you what the plot was without looking up the synopsis. It's something to do with hell with one L trying to start Ragnarok or some shit. To be honest, the plot isn't Viking's strong suit. Its story is like when you're sitting in a job interview and the combination of worry and fear makes you start thinking about something else, and before you know it, you suddenly realise that you haven't listened to a word the guy said in the past hour, and you're desperately trying to piece together what he's talking about out of the remainder of the conversation so you can answer and not look like a complete twat. Well, that's what the story in Viking feels like. Anytime a character would start talking, I would just be overcome with a deep, thick boredom, where I would just switch off and try rereading it in my head like getting stuck on a sentence. Either way, from what I can gather, Freya gives us some kind of magical iPad called Breezing Garmin, which, if you made the mistake of taking English Lit at A-level, you might recognise from Beowulf, though in that it was just a necklace, I think. After this, you're pretty much just left to your own devices to how you want to take the islands back. The starting town is nice enough, with a number of people you can talk to, most of which don't really offer much beyond fluff to layer out some kind of setting. Overall, the voice acting is a bit of a mixed bag. On the plus side, this game is more northern than fucking Catholic Lubin in terms of accents, and most of the actors do a good job of remaining convincing.
Gold is a valuable currency, Skarin, even in these dark times.
Ah, Skarin. I'd serve you, but I'm out of mead at the moment. Hell's forces have stopped my supplies. Those lucky enough to have survived could do with a drink.
Skarin! My heart sank when I heard that you had fallen to the Harbinger's blade and the Father's fate had also befallen the Son.
But some have a real bloke that did a bit of community theatre vibe.
Skarin, look outside Brighthelm. When Hell's legion arrived on Midgard, darkness fell across the land. Hell's poison fills the air.
Well, it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Or to take...
The voice cast of this game is just fucking weird in general. It's mostly just non-list UK actors, besides Brian Blessed obviously, including such talents as that one guy from Alien 3, Urza from the Dark Crystal, the bloke that voices both Solaire and Vile Blood Hunter Alfred, and Sebulba. The game's main selling point at the time was big battles that you could run around in. It was the same for Spartan Total Warrior, but overall these battles are just bigger. Though they aren't as fun as you might think, but we'll get back to that later. To get to these battles, you have to run around the map collecting loot and taking over enemy camps and strongholds to build up your army and unlock more of the map. As you clear these areas, most will usually head over to your stronghold without question, but most need you to do something first before they'll join you. This usually boils down to go and get them something or free some soldiers and then they'll come. Though seeing as how I'm the one that freed you single-handedly and almost died in the process, this feels like they're taking the piss a bit. Mostly it's a pretty dull gameplay loop with not a lot of variation over the course of the campaign, so surely the combat must be good to make up for it, right? Well, kind of. I will say this game is a hell of a lot more violent than its Spartan counterpart. Enemies aren't very attached to their own limbs, with most flying off after a few hits, letting you do a finishing move. So at least they don't make you pay for the blood this time. The game follows a pretty typical hack and slash structure of having light and heavy attacks, which, to be honest, you can beat the game with just using them exclusively. You can learn new moves at the arena, and while some are quite useful, like the Fenrir's bite takedown and Thor's hammer, most are completely redundant since none of them give you much of an increase in damage and don't tend to affect enemies. Even larger mobs like the shield enemies can be outdone by the basic bash move. In fact, I'd argue it's faster than using any of the shield breaking moves. Sure, Hell's Fury can technically let you break shields faster, but it leaves you really open every time you do it, especially in battles. If you actually want to do any kind of additional damage, I'd say go for the runes, though even these are mostly useless aside from the lightning one. You can charge your runes using rage, which builds up when you perform finishes. You still get some from killing enemies without doing finishes, but you get far less than you would with them. Besides looking cool, the finishing move also gives you invulnerability while you use them, so performing them is pretty much required. As for the runes, you have a choice between fire, lightning and ice, but I've already said that you should just use lightning most of the time. Each rune has a basic and special attack which uses more rage. Fire does what you would expect, lighting enemies on fire and causing damage over time, using the basic attack, and the special sends out a column of fire that sets multiple enemies on fire. Freeze is pretty handy, especially when you find yourself trapped by a large group and can't get a hit in. A single hit with freeze will slow down enemies, allowing you to thin the numbers you have to deal with a bit, and a second hit will shatter them. The special move is kind of okay, where you send out a shockwave of ice, but getting enemies to actually stand in it is pretty hard, especially with smaller groups, since it only appears on a very small ring around Scarran. Lightning is pretty much better all round. The basic attack electrocutes enemies, increasing the amount of damage you do to them, and the special move locks onto any enemy and pretty much insta-kills them. Well, at least the smaller units. Equipping runes is also handy in battle and ambushes, since the buff also applies to your surrounding units, so that's cool. Its fast travel system is awkward as well. As you walk around the map, you'll slowly discover more and more of these ley stones that you can teleport to. Well, that's alright, but the ley stones are often miles away from the place you want to go to, or are just in weird places. The other problem is that the game doesn't have a World of Warcraft Hearthstone, so if you want to fast travel across the map, then you'll have to first travel to a ley stone that could be miles away. Unless you die. When your character dies, it returns you to the main hub portal, so if I wanted to get somewhere quickly, I would just end up throwing myself off the nearest cliff, and then use the home ley stone to get to where I want to go. And even when you aren't using a fast travel system, the game has you run marathon distances to get to anything, which doesn't help when the map is unclear as to what elevation things are at. Maybe it was just me being an idiot, but the amount of times I had to run all the way across the map only to have to run it out from a different angle just because the entrance was on the other side of a cliff but marked weirdly is ridiculous. Also, why do I have to tap B to use the fast travel system? Actually, why do I have to tap B to do everything? Tap B to untie, tap B to open doors, tap B to summon dragons. The game's visuals are okay. For some reason, Scarran seems to have some kind of bloom or highlight around him at all times because of the breezing garment on his back that just looks awful. The light coming from his back is already pretty irritating by itself. I don't know why they couldn't have just implied that it's in your pocket the whole time. As for the enemy design, it's pretty uninspired. Nondescript pale demons and massive dudes in armor is all you have to look forward to. That and Scarran is basically just your typical Conan stand-in. Most of the environments are pretty bland as well, with everything looking like it has some kind of grey filter applied. This was 2008 though, so I guess this was around the time that every game developer suddenly forgot that colour existed. Half the time everything is covered in fog and if not rain. Even when you clear an area and the rain dissipates and birds start singing, everything still looks like a woodland photograph someone spilled Quaker Oats on, because the game has some kind of inbuilt grey tint filter apparently. Though none of these effects are as obnoxious as the light effect that comes on anytime Freya calls you. It pretty much makes your screen white out for a whole 2 seconds, so if you're playing this at night you better be prepared to have your retinas burned out. As for side objectives, there's only really 2. One is finding smaller squads that you can pad your army out with that are hidden all over the map, and the other is collecting mead. You can get at least 500 apiece for each barrel that you find. Not that finding gold is that much trouble though. Most areas have an enormous amount of loot, with the smallest denominations being sacks going up to large pots and chests. You can even buy treasure maps that point out the location of nearby loot on your minimap. Oh yeah, the shop. There really isn't anything to upgrade in this game besides moves and runes. I would have liked to see some kind of blacksmith where you could get new weapons, instead of just upgrading the normal ones and having the model not change. Either way, other than the treasure maps, the shop just sells consumables which vary in their usefulness. Health potions are pretty self-explanatory, but you can only hold 3 of them at a time, and most battles produce green orbs that will give you a small amount of health anyway. Bombs can be useful, especially during battles where you need to remove large groups, but the lock-on can occasionally confuse the camera and send the bomb off in a completely different direction. And as for throwing throwing axes, they're fun for a while but really don't have any use besides stun-locking bosses when you're low on health. Or for stealth, but stealth is a bit of an afterthought. When you get close to enemies, Scarron will drop his stance and you can sneak up behind enemies and take them out. At the start, this is kind of pointless though, since pressing X just does a regular strong attack, which 9 times out of 10 won't kill them and will just initiate combat anyway. At least until you buy Fenrir's Bite, which lets you take them down in one. There are stealth missions of a sort, mainly just prior to battles that are just missions of attrition by sneaking into their base and stealing or destroying something, but really the stealth is so basic that there isn't much fun to be had from it since the combat is the game's strong suit. As you slowly go along completing objectives, you'll eventually fill out an assault criteria, which is basically just a list of things you need to complete before the game will let you start a battle. I guess now is as good a time as any to talk about the battles, since we're coming up on the first major one. The first battle isn't as large and impressive as the other ones, but even here it's plain to see my main issues with the battle mechanic, and that's the shamans, or shamans. I've never really been sure what the proper pronunciation is, to be honest.
Shaman.
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 Shame.
Battles will carry on endlessly unless you kill the enemy shaman, otherwise they'll just keep spawning more enemies. You do this by running past the big exciting battle and chipping away at magic posts until the shaman dies. There's no penalty for dying in battles, to the point where I finished the game not knowing if there is actually some kind of lose state, so you basically die in the process of chipping away at the shaman, respawn, and then just sprint over and repeat. Now you can use the dragons to take them out instantly, but these cost dragon runes to use. Granted, you can get them by taking out higher ranked units, but the boss and mini-boss fights in this game are really fucking dull. Just dodge and peck away until you get a prompt to do a QTE and that's it. It would be better if I could actually get involved with the big fucking battle that's going on around me and not skirt around it to move units forwards. But here it just seems like the large amount of enemies are just there to sell copies and you never really get involved with them. Anyway, we finished the second battle and we're introduced to a boss fight with Drakan. You discover that Drakan is basically the dark version of Scarron, who got friend-zoned by Freya so went over to hell out of spite. Again, the story is just so bland that I'm finding it difficult to care about any of this. Beating the shit out of things is fun, but I don't really have any reason beyond thing bad. They try and have some complexity by having Hell want to get rid of the elitism surrounding Valhalla, leading to some questions about whether Freya is really worth aligning with, but it's just so heavy-handed and not that interesting. And on top of that, it just gets lost under a dump truck worth of grey fantasy paste. The same goes for Scarron. There's nothing wrong with having a silent protagonist, but Scarron just comes off as awkward in cutscenes. Supposedly, he's meant to have some tragic backstory about how his father was a respected warrior and dies fighting a legion, but it's presented as a side note and has no bearing on the main plot, so why should I care? Scarron never shows any emotion. Literally, his face never pulls a single expression. So how am I supposed to believe that he's struggling through any of this? Beyond this, you just carry on to the next island, do a bunch of busy work, and then do exactly the same on the next location. Free up camps, get the dragon rune, and sneak into the base to steal something. The game is like a precursor to the established Ubisoft sandbox formula, where all you need to do is run around the map doing the same objectives over and over. While the combat is fun at times, its longevity isn't enough to survive hours into the game, and by the end it just drags massively, to the point where most of the time I wouldn't even bother engaging in combat towards the later stages. They try and have some kind of enemy variations with the berserkers and the tougher commanders, and later on the giants. The berserkers hit faster but have less health, and the commanders just basically do the same thing but with more health. And the giants are massively disappointing. They introduce them to you as this big set piece when really all you have to do is skirt around its ankles and then destroy its Achilles tendon. Beyond the most basic hack and slash gameplay, there really isn't much left of the game. I didn't bother unlocking any more of the moves since really there isn't much incentive. I played the game on its hardest difficulty and the majority of it was far too easy, with some sections that are less difficult and more just annoying. It's as if everything in this game is half-baked. The stealth mechanics are extremely shallow for how much the game seems to want you to use them, and infiltrating bases becomes piss easy because kiting enemies is that simple. By the end of the game, its attempt at making things more difficult is just to throw more shield enemies at you. Make friends with the ledge if you decide to play this game. When faced with a bunch of sponge enemies, being near a ledge is a godsend because you can just bash everyone off it and have the fight done in seconds. Which shouldn't be something that you want to do, but by introducing so many sponges and slowing down the at one time fast and exciting combat, the game just makes you want to fast forward through the vast majority of it. And we're pretty much done talking about the game as far as mechanics and presentation go. It's just that light on the ground that there really isn't much to it, so beyond this point it's spoiler territory. But to be honest, what little story there is in this game isn't worth finding out for yourself. Skip to here if you really give a shit about playing this. Don't say I didn't warn you though. After a large amount of busy work, you finally get the last dragon gem and we can start the final battle. But before this, there's a mission where you get baked and find out your father isn't a real warrior and that Scarron is adopted. This has no bearing on the plot and Scarron is the blankest of slates, so why this is in here and why the game thinks I should give a shit, I don't know. But onto the battle. Admittedly, the final battle looks awesome, but once again, the bullshit mechanics mean that we won't be enjoying any of it. and before long you reach the tower. The tower goes on for way too long, with Scarron battling his way up and eventually reaching Hell with one L, and she transforms into one of the shittiest pieces of character design I've seen in a long time. They couldn't bother to make the final boss a new and interesting enemy. Instead, they sew an enlarged version of Freya with her baps out onto the same fucking giant model you've been fighting for the past few hours. She looks like a shit Quelag, essentially, and the actual fight is somehow even more disappointing. You just run around a big fiery room and slash at the same fucking shaman poles you've seen time and time again, with the only difference being that these poles take 5 hits instead of 3, and they send ads at you. I can't explain the level of sheer fucking lazy game design that this final boss is. It's just so rushed and uninvolving that they might as well have not bothered having a boss fight at all. I would have been happier just fighting my way up to the tower, not this shitty fucking QTE bullshit that takes no real effort to beat and is over in about a minute. The last time I saw a game's main antagonist taken out with a shit QTE like this was in Space Marine, and at least that had the 40k visual style to make things at least aesthetically interesting. That and having a character that, despite being a slab of meat stuffed in power armor, at least reacted to things and had some kind of emotional involvement with what was going on. But with Scarron there's nothing. At the start of the fight, Scarron runs up some stairs and a cutscene plays where you and Hell look at each other for a moment, but there's nothing. Not even a single facial muscle moves in either of these cutscenes. No anime monologue about plans to take over the world either. After you take out Hell, a rushed voiceover cutscene plays where Freya denies Scarron entrance into Valhalla for seemingly no other reason than to be a dick, and so Scarron decides to free Fenrir himself and bring Ragnarok, with the gods dying and the world entering into a new stage of life. To be honest, they kept making references to Fenrir throughout the game, and bringing him up to the point where I thought Fenrir would be the final boss. But no, it's all build-up with no payoff, and it's not even interesting build-up. You free him and that's it. Wow, that would have at least been cool to see instead of giving it to us in this shitty low-effort comic book format and calling it a day. This ending reeks of a rush job. Maybe the funds dried up or the deadline came too quick, but this is just dull on every level. And that is pretty much all Viking has to offer. It's okay, but it never really evolves beyond being okay. The gameplay is fun for the most part, but the game's enemy types and progression means that the combat you start the game with doesn't change. There's no need to learn the game's systems and moves because the standard attack and shield bash are all you really need. Its story is bland and essentially non-existent, and the game's visual design is just as bland, with most of the characters looking like a 12-year-old's D&D character design. Armor on top of armor with nothing inside it. If you do end up wanting to play this, I'd say play through the first island and then stop, because the game will just repeat that exact same loop ad nauseum. Not that a game can't have a simple loop, but for that game to work there needs to be a good amount of presentation and changing situations with the mechanics to keep the player interested. It's worth it for the battles, but really your involvement with them means you'd be better off playing Total War and spectating those fights. Can I recommend Viking? No. But I do have fond memories of playing it back on the 360 when there was nothing else to play. But personally I think a memory is what it should have stayed as.
I shall open the gates for you now, and may Freya bless you.